We have nothing left.
Nothing.
We have already discussed how medieval English people coped with the cold using hearth fires, warm clothing, and food supplies. But beyond these obvious facts, there are details that reveal their lives from a completely new and unexpected angle. After all, winter was not just a time for survival, but also a period when people resorted to the most extraordinary and sometimes surprising methods to ensure their comfort and safety. They used natural conditions to their advantage, changed their usual routes, and even the architectural features of their homes to preserve precious heat. These little-known facts give us a more complete picture of how inventive the people of that era were. They didn't just wait out the cold, they actively adapted to it, using everything at their disposal. Watch the video to the end to find out how frozen rivers became roads, how house walls turned into beds, and how even the harshest climate could be turned to man's advantage. In the modern imagination, a medieval bed is usually a wooden frame with a straw or feather mattress. This is generally true, but people used more complex and interesting techniques to stay warm. In some houses, especially in rural areas, sleeping places were integrated directly into the walls or located in special niches. These bed stoves had one or more walls made of stone or brick and were adjacent to a fireplace or hearth. In this way, these walls were heated by the fire, giving off heat to the sleeping area. This created the effect of a stone oven, providing warmth throughout the night, even after the fire in the fireplace had died down. This architectural feature was not just a convenience, but a necessity, as nights in England were particularly harsh. The heat accumulated during the day was retained inside the niche where the bed was located, and thick curtains or wooden doors helped to keep it inside. This created a kind of thermal cocoon that protected against drafts and low temperatures in the rest of the house. Thus, the bed became not just a place to sleep, but a kind of refuge where one could safely survive the cold. In addition to stationary solutions, there were also more mobile ones. People filled linen bags with hot coals wrapped in cloth and placed them in their beds before going to sleep. These were the prototypes of modern hot water bottles, which allowed you to quickly warm up your bed. Such bags could also be used to warm hands and feet when a person was in a cold room. They were indispensable during long evening activities such as spinning or weaving when hands would get cold. Special attention was paid not only to the bed itself, but also to its filling. Mattresses stuffed with straw were common, but in wealthier homes, feathers were used, which retained heat better. Woolen blankets were placed on top of the mattress, sometimes in several layers to provide maximum insulation. Fur blankets were also often used. Of course, they were not available to everyone, but if possible, fur was one of the best means of protection against the cold. In some houses, sleeping places were also located on raised platforms to keep them away from the cold earthen floor. Sometimes, special containers with hot water were even placed under the bed, which slowly gave off heat, ensuring a comfortable sleep. The use of such devices shows that people actively sought ways to increase their comfort, not limiting themselves to open fires. In addition to their obvious purpose, beds and sleeping niches often served as storage spaces. They could be used to hide valuables or, for example, bags of dried herbs, which not only smelled nice, but also helped repel insects, which was important even in winter. Thus, the sleeping area was not just a part of everyday life, but a multifunctional element that helped solve several problems at once, from heating to storage. Which of these unusual heating methods would you try if you lived in the Middle Ages? Write about it in the comments. It seems that in winter, when the ground is frozen and the weather does not allow outdoor work, construction should come to a complete halt. However, in the Middle Ages, winter was a time for certain types of construction and preparation work that were difficult or impossible at other times of the year. One such activity was the preparation of timber for construction. In winter, when the trees shed their leaves, the wood had less moisture, which made it more suitable for construction. Moreover, felled trees were easier to transport across frozen ground and rivers. This was especially important when it came to large logs for beams and floor slabs. Frozen ponds and roads became ideal routes for transporting heavy and bulky loads that would get stuck in the mud during the warmer months. This method not only saved energy, but also allowed more material to be transported at one time. Winter was also a time for repairing and strengthening walls. Cracks in the masonry were filled with clay and straw to help retain heat. Sometimes this work was done indoors to protect the walls from moisture and cold air. These seasonal tasks were part of the cyclical life of the people, where each period of the year had its own specific purpose. Winter was a time for thorough preparation for spring, when full-scale construction could resume. Master masons could work on stone indoors, where their tools and materials would not freeze. They cut blocks, shaped arches and columns, which were then installed when the weather became more favorable. This approach required foresight and planning several months in advance. In addition to preparing wood, the winter months were used to extract certain building materials. For example, in some regions, peat was extracted and then used as fuel for furnaces and forges. The frozen ground made it easier to cut peat blocks and transport them. Thus, even the extraction of raw materials was tied to the season, and winter played a key role in this. In addition, peasants and builders were engaged in harvesting straw and reeds, which they used to make roofs. A layer of dry reeds or straw laid on the roof was an excellent insulator that helped keep the house warm. People not only worked on their homes, but also on the tools they needed for this work. Winter was the ideal time to repair and make new equipment. Blacksmiths worked in their forges, where fire was not only a source of heat, but also a necessary tool. They repaired old tools, created new ones, and forged nails and hinges, which were essential for construction. This work, which required skill and endurance, was part of the winter routine. As a result, winter was not a time when life came to a standstill. It was a time when people prepared for spring, gathered materials, repaired their homes, and made tools. They turned the cold and ice to their advantage, making possible what would have been impossible in the warmer months. This approach demonstrates not just resilience, but a deep understanding of nature and the ability to use its characteristics to their advantage. Just think about it. People learn to turn the harshest time of the year into an opportunity for growth. So maybe in our lives, what seems like an obstacle may actually be a unique opportunity. But let's go back to the Middle Ages and see what other opportunities these people had. In summer and spring, rivers were the most important trade and transport routes in England. However, in winter, when they froze over, travel by water became impossible. But instead of completely stopping transport, people adapted to the new conditions. The frozen rivers turned into a kind of ice roads along which heavy loads could be transported on sleds. This made it possible to move goods that would have been impossible to transport on the usual dirty and broken roads. It was possible to move faster on ice than on snow-covered roads and cover long distances in less time. This created a kind of winter trade route that was used until the ice began to melt. Such routes were certainly dangerous, but they made it possible to maintain economic activity at a time when it would otherwise have been impossible. The use of frozen rivers as roads is a clear example of how people were able to use natural conditions to their advantage. These ice roads were especially valuable for transporting heavy and bulky cargo, such as building stone or timber. In warmer months, such cargo was often transported on rafts or barges along rivers, but with the onset of winter, this option disappeared. However, the frozen surface of the river allowed sleds to be used, which glided over the ice, making the work much easier. This also made it possible to deliver goods to settlements that were far from the main roads but had access to a river. In cities located on the banks of large rivers, such as the Thames, trade did not cease completely. Instead, it moved to a new level, using the frozen surface as the main thoroughfare. Of course, traveling on ice required special care and knowledge of local conditions. Travelers and traders had to know how thick the ice was and where it was safe to travel. There was always a danger of falling through the ice, so people tried to travel during the day and in groups. But even with these risks, the ice roads offered unique opportunities that more than made up for any dangers. They were vital for keeping towns and villages supplied, which would otherwise have been cut off from the outside world. In addition to trade, frozen rivers were used for communication and entertainment. People could travel across the ice on foot or on skates, which made it much easier to visit neighbors or the nearest village. Frozen rivers and lakes became places for various games and activities, which was especially important during the long winter months when leisure opportunities were limited. Thus, what was a natural obstacle in summer became a natural route in winter, connecting people and settlements. This demonstrates the remarkable ability of humans to adapt to changing conditions and find a way out of any seemingly hopeless situation. Instead of waiting for spring to come, people actively used the resources that nature provided them. They did not simply survive, but developed their trade and social ties, even in the harshest conditions. This approach to life, based on practicality and ingenuity, is one of the key features that allowed medieval society to flourish. Monasteries in medieval England were not only centers of spiritual life, but also important elements of the winter survival system. Unlike peasant houses, monastery buildings were more solid and better heated. They had large food reserves and, as a rule, had a more developed water supply system. Thus, monasteries were a kind of islands of survival during the winter months. They were built of stone and brick, with thick walls and high ceilings, which helped to retain heat. Inside the buildings, special stoves were often installed, which were fueled by charcoal or firewood and had a system of chimneys, allowing for more efficient heating of the rooms. These stoves were not just sources of heat, but real engineering structures that gave monasteries a huge advantage over simple dwellings. Monks were not only engaged in prayer, but also in charity. They opened their doors to travelers who were caught off guard on the road, providing them with lodging and food. For poor families, monasteries could be a source of help. They distributed surplus food, clothing, and fuel, which helped the needy survive the harshest frosts. This support system was vital and served as a kind of social network that helped the community cope with difficulties. Monasteries had huge agricultural lands and reserves, which were intended not only for their own needs, but also to help anyone in trouble. They stored grain, dried vegetables, meat, and fish, which they harvested in the summer. Thanks to this, the monks were able to provide for themselves and those in need throughout the winter. In addition, monasteries were centers of knowledge. They kept chronicles, and monks recorded all natural phenomena. Thanks to this, we know how harsh winters were in the Middle Ages. Their records often mention severe frosts and snowfalls that lasted for several months. This shows that winter was not just a season, but a real test that had to be prepared for in advance. Monasteries also produced medicinal herbs and ointments that helped to cope with colds. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation and was not available to everyone, which made monasteries even more valuable. Thus, monasteries in medieval England were not just religious centers, but real fortresses of survival. They not only provided for themselves, but also helped the whole community cope with the difficulties that winter brought. They were a source of heat, food, shelter, and knowledge, which were so necessary in that era. These islands of civilization were vital and served as an example of how to survive in the harshest conditions. They were not just part of society, but its heart. Within the monastery walls, unique survival skills were also developed. Monks kept bees, which provided them with wax for candles, and honey, which was used as a sweetener and preservative. Honey was especially valuable in winter because it did not spoil and could be stored for a very long time. It was a kind of medieval equivalent of modern energy bars, providing monks and those in need with energy. Monastery gardens, although snow-covered in winter, provided an opportunity to gather medicinal herbs that could be used to prepare infusions and decoctions. Monks knew which plants could help with colds or coughs, and this knowledge was invaluable. They were the first healers who helped people cope with illness without modern medicines. Thus, monasteries in medieval England were not just centers of spiritual life, but true fortresses of survival. They were a source of warmth, food, shelter, and knowledge that were so necessary in that era. These islands of civilization were vital and served as examples of how to survive in the harshest conditions. They were not just part of society, but its heart. And if monasteries provided external assistance, what helped people keep warm right under their feet? Let's talk about that right now. Although people had hearths and the walls of their houses were made of stone or clay, the main source of heat in their homes was what was under their feet. The floors in most houses were earthen and covered with a layer of straw. This not only made the floor softer, but also served an important function of thermal insulation, separating the inhabitants from the cold, frozen ground. The straw was changed regularly, which helped to keep it relatively clean and dry. Sometimes dried herbs were added to the straw to create a more pleasant smell in the home. Straw, being an excellent natural insulator, retained the heat coming from the hearth and prevented it from escaping into the ground. In houses where there was no stone hearth and the fire burned directly on the earthen floor, this layer of straw played an even more important role. It protected against drafts and cold coming from below and created more comfortable living conditions. This simple but effective method was available to almost every family, as straw was easy to obtain after the harvest. People often slept directly on the floor, covered with blankets, and the layer of straw was their only protection from the bitter cold. In addition to straw, other natural materials were also used. In some regions with swamps, peat was used to insulate floors. It was laid in a thick layer and covered with straw. Peat was an excellent insulator and also had antiseptic properties, which helped to combat odors and bacteria. This approach to home construction demonstrates how well people understood nature and knew how to use its resources for survival. Straw was a multifunctional material. It was used not only for floors but also for insulating walls and roofs. Cracks in the walls were filled with straw and clay, and the roofs were covered with a thick layer of dry reeds or straw, which provided excellent protection from rain and snow and also retained heat. This material was so important that its collection and storage were among the main autumn activities. People carefully dried the straw and stacked it in special stacks so that it would not get wet and rot. The use of straw and other natural materials for insulation is a striking example of how people in the Middle Ages created comfort and coziness without modern technology. Their knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, and they knew how to use what was at hand. They did not just survive, they created their own world, in which even the simplest things such as straw played a huge role. In winter, the floors in houses were not only warm, but also clean, as straw could be easily replaced. This helped maintain hygiene in the home, which was especially important when people spent most of their time indoors. And while it may seem simple and even primitive, for the people of that era, it was a real lifesaver. It was their way of fighting the cold, and they did it with intelligence and ingenuity. The use of straw for flooring had another important advantage. It helped absorb moisture that inevitably formed as a result of breathing and cooking. This prevented mold and unpleasant odors, which was an important aspect of hygiene. In addition, straw flooring was soft, making it an ideal place to sleep and rest. People could simply lay a blanket on it and settle down for the night, which was much more comfortable than sleeping on the cold, hard ground. Straw was also used as filling for mattresses and pillows. It was dried, chopped, and stuffed into special covers. These mattresses were warm and soft, and replacing them regularly helped keep the home clean. It was a kind of medieval equivalent of modern mattresses, only using natural materials. In some houses with clay or stone floors, straw was used as a temporary covering. It was scattered on the floor to make it warmer and softer. This was especially important in winter when the floors became very cold. People used straw to create warm islands around the hearth where they could sit and work. It was a kind of mobile insulation that could be used as needed. Thus, straw was not just a material, but a true universal survival tool. It was used for warmth, hygiene, and comfort. It was available to everyone and did not require any special skills to use. It was their way of adapting to harsh conditions, and they did so with intelligence and ingenuity. In addition to well-known methods of preservation, such as salting and smoking, people also used more primitive but very effective methods. Vegetables such as carrots, turnips, and parsnips were stored in special pits dug in the ground, which were then covered with a layer of straw and earth. These pits maintained a constant low temperature, which prevented the vegetables from freezing. This method was especially popular among peasant families, as it did not require any special materials or tools other than a shovel. Such pits, or root cellars as they were called, were often located on high ground to avoid moisture accumulation. They were dug deep enough to reach a layer of soil where the temperature remained stable throughout the winter. Dry straw was laid at the bottom of the pit, and then vegetables were laid out tightly. The pit was covered with another layer of straw and then filled with earth, which provided reliable protection from frost. This simple method allowed the harvest to be preserved for months and provided people with food until spring. In addition to root vegetables, other foods were also stored in such pits. For example, apples could be stored in them, as they also kept well in a cool, moist environment. Salted meat could also be stored in the pits, wrapped in cloth to protect it from moisture. This method was a kind of prototype of the modern refrigerator. Only the earth itself acted as the cooling unit. This method was so effective that it was used for many centuries, and even today, similar structures can be found in some rural areas. For peasant families whose diet was very limited, these reserves were vital. They provided people with essential vitamins and nutrients that were unavailable in winter. Without these reserves, people would not have been able to survive the winter, and this simple but ingenious method allowed them to do so. It demonstrates how well people knew their land and how they were able to use its resources for their survival. Preserving food was not just a task, but a real art. People knew which vegetables and fruits could be stored together and which could not. They knew that if good ventilation was not provided, food could spoil. Therefore, small holes were made in the pits and covered with straw to allow air to flow in but keep the cold out. This was a real skill that required a lot of knowledge and experience. This method was not just a way of storing food, but part of a way of life that was closely connected to nature and its cycles. In addition, these root cellars were not just pits, but part of a complex food management system. People understood that different foods require different storage conditions. For example, apples, although they could be stored in pits, often had their own small cellar so that their aroma would not be transferred to other vegetables. Also, to protect vegetables from rodents, people placed rose hips or fir branches at the bottom of the pit. This was a kind of natural repellent that worked very effectively. To keep root vegetables fresh, people also used sand. They covered the vegetables with layers of sand, which absorbed excess moisture and helped maintain optimal humidity levels. This method was especially popular for storing carrots and parsnips. This approach to food storage shows how carefully people planned their supplies and how they used every opportunity to preserve their harvest. In addition to vegetables, grain could also be stored in such pits, but it required special conditions. Grain was stored in special barns built on high ground to protect it from moisture. But in cases where there were no barns, grain could be stored in pits lined with straw and dry leaves. This method was less reliable but still helped to preserve part of the harvest. Thus, root cellars were not just pits, but part of a complex food management system that allowed people to survive the harshest months. These simple but ingenious methods were based on a deep understanding of nature and its cycles. They were part of a way of life that was closely connected to the land and its resources. Have you ever tried working at night? Of course you have. But would you do it if you couldn't turn on the lights? It seems difficult, but medieval people had their own special lighting. Keep watching the video to find out the answer. With the onset of winter, daylight hours became very short, and most work was moved to the evening. To extend the time available for manual labor, people used not only candles, but also moonlight. On clear, frosty nights, the snow reflected the moonlight, creating surprisingly bright illumination. People could use this natural light to perform simple tasks such as repairing tools or sorting grain without having to waste precious candles. This was not just a convenience, but a real lifesaver for those who could not afford expensive candles made from animal fat or wax. This natural lighting had its advantages. It was soft and even, allowing people to work on small details. In the moonlight, enhanced by the reflection from the snow, people could engage in activities such as basket weaving, sewing clothes, and making simple wooden objects. It was a time when families gathered around the hearth or window to work and socialize by moonlight. This was not work in the modern sense, but rather a part of everyday life. During the winter months, when the nights were especially long, the moon became not just a celestial body, but a reliable source of light. People knew the lunar cycles and planned their activities accordingly. They knew when the full moon would be and could prepare for night work. It was a kind of planning based on observations of nature. Moonlight was available to everyone, regardless of their social status, which made it a universal resource. This use of moonlight was part of the practical wisdom of medieval people. They understood that nature could give them everything they needed if only they learned to understand and use it. They knew that the moon could be not only a symbol of the night, but also a source of light that could help them in their daily lives. This approach to life, based on the use of natural resources, was key to survival in that era. Night work was also a time for socializing and learning. While adults worked, they could tell stories, sing songs, and pass on their knowledge and experience. It was a time when the family came together and everyone could contribute to the common good. Nighttime activities were not just a way to extend the daylight hours, but part of the social life of medieval society. Thus, moonlight was not just a beautiful phenomenon, but an important element of winter survival. It allowed people to work, socialize, and learn without wasting their limited resources. It was a symbol of hope and resilience that helped people get through the darkest and coldest months. It was their way of fighting the darkness and cold, and they did so with intelligence and ingenuity. In addition, moonlight played an important role in religious ceremonies. Many winter holidays and rituals were held at night, and the moon was their natural source of light. People would gather together to sing songs and dance, and the moonlight created a special atmosphere. It was a time when people felt closer to nature and to higher powers. In some regions where winters were particularly harsh, people used moonlight for navigation. At night, when the roads were covered with snow, the moon was their only source of light. This was especially important for those who lived in remote areas where there was no possibility of calling for help. The use of moonlight also had social consequences. People were closer to each other as they spent more time together. This made them more adaptable to life in harsh conditions. They did not just survive, but developed skills and knowledge that were passed down from generation to generation. This approach to life, based on the use of natural resources, was key to survival in that era. In the end, moonlight wasn't just a pretty thing, but an important part of surviving the winter. It let people work, communicate, and learn without using up their limited resources. It was a symbol of hope and resilience that helped people get through the darkest and coldest months. It was their way of fighting the darkness and cold, and they did so with intelligence and ingenuity. Although it was not customary to keep animals in people's homes, many peasant families lived in close contact with their livestock. In winter, when the coldest temperatures set in, some animals, such as pigs or sheep, could be kept in the same room as people. This was not only convenient, but also served as an additional source of heat, as the animals, like small living stoves, gave off heat that helped maintain the temperature in the dwelling. This approach was not just a temporary solution, but part of a way of life where humans and animals existed in symbiosis, helping each other to survive. This method of heating was, of course, not ideal. It created certain inconveniences associated with the smell and keeping animals indoors. However, for peasants whose homes were small and poorly insulated, it was a real lifesaver. Especially on the coldest nights when the temperature outside dropped below zero, the presence of livestock in the house could mean the difference between survival and freezing to death. Pigs and sheep give off a lot of heat, and this heat, although not very strong, helped to maintain the temperature in the dwelling at an acceptable level. It was a kind of bioheating. In addition to heat, animals also served as a source of food. In winter, when food supplies ran out, people could use animals for milk or meat. This was especially important for families who did not have large food reserves. Thus, animals were not only a source of heat, but also a guarantee of survival during the most difficult months. This method was so widespread that in some regions there were even special buildings that connected the living quarters with the barn. This allowed animals and people to be close to each other while still having their own space. Such structures were very convenient as they allowed people to care for their livestock without going outside in the cold. This was especially important for those who lived in remote areas where there was no possibility of seeking help. The use of animals as living heaters was part of the practical wisdom of medieval people. They understood that nature could give them everything they needed if only they learned to understand and use it. They did not just survive, but created their own world in which even the simplest things, such as animals, played a huge role. This approach to life, based on the use of natural resources, was key to survival in that era. Houses where people and animals lived under one roof often had a special structure. The living quarters were located on the second floor, and the barn was on the first floor. In this way, the heat given off by the animals rose upward, warming the living quarters. This was a kind of primitive heating system that was available even to the poorest families. This method was very effective as it allowed the use of natural heat without wasting precious firewood or coal. It was a real lifesaver in conditions where fuel was very expensive and difficult to obtain. In addition, animals needed special care in winter. They had to be fed, watered, and protected from the cold. Keeping animals in the house made this work much easier. People could monitor their condition without going outside. This was especially important for those who lived in remote areas where there was no possibility of seeking help. In some regions where winters were particularly harsh, people used not only pigs and sheep, but also other animals. For example, chickens were kept in homes to provide additional warmth. This was a form of collective survival, where every member of the family, including animals, contributed to the common good. This approach to life was based on mutual aid and respect for nature. Such coexistence with animals also had social consequences. People were closer to nature. They understood its cycles and characteristics. This made them more adaptable to life in harsh conditions. They did not just survive, but developed skills and knowledge that were passed down from generation to generation. This approach to life, based on the use of natural resources, was key to survival in that era. Although people did not have modern refrigerators, they knew how to use the cold to their advantage. In winter, when rivers and lakes froze over, people harvested huge chunks of ice, which they could store in deep pits covered with a layer of earth and straw. These ice reserves were used to cool food throughout the year. Ice could be used to keep meat or fish fresh, as well as to cool drinks during the hot summer months. This method was not just a way of storing ice, but a real art. People knew where to find the cleanest and the strongest ice that would not melt throughout the year. They used special tools to cut large blocks of ice, which were then transported on sleds to special pits, which were a kind of prototype of modern ice houses. These pits were usually dug several meters deep, and their walls and bottoms were lined with stones and straw for extra insulation. This allowed the ice to remain solid even on the hottest days. The use of ice was especially important for preserving meat and fish. While smoking and salting were the main methods of preservation at the time, freezing allowed food to be kept fresher. This was especially important for wealthy families who could afford to freeze meat and fish for special occasions. Ice was also used to cool wine and other beverages, which was a real luxury. It was a kind of medieval indulgence that was only available during the summer months. Harvesting ice was hard and dangerous work. People had to work quickly to prevent the ice from melting and be very careful not to fall through the ice. But this work paid off handsomely, as ice was a priceless resource. It was used not only to cool food, but also for medical purposes, such as cooling compresses. It was a versatile resource that was available to anyone willing to work for it. In addition to storing food, ice played an important role in everyday life. For example, it was used to cool drinks, especially during the hot season. Ice was placed in special bowls, which were then placed in wine cellars to keep the wine cool. This was a kind of medieval pleasure that was only available during the summer months. In addition, ice was used to make refreshing drinks that were very popular among the nobility. People mixed ice with fruit juice and honey, which was a kind of prototype of modern sorbet. In the colder months, ice was used for insulation. It was placed in special containers, which were then placed against the walls to prevent the cold from entering. This was a kind of natural air conditioning that helped maintain the temperature in the home at a comfortable level. This method was especially popular in homes where it was not possible to install a stove. Thus, people in the Middle Ages were true masters at using natural resources. They knew that cold could be not only an enemy, but also a friend. and they knew how to use it to their advantage. They created their own refrigerators, which were based on simplicity and ingenuity. This approach to life, based on the use of natural resources, was key to survival in that era. We have learned that life in the Middle Ages was full of nuances and interesting solutions that we often overlook. People did not simply suffer from the cold, but actively fought against it, using their ingenuity and observation skills. From bed stoves to ice roads and monastery shelters, all these details show how important it was to adapt to the conditions. Which of these lesser-known details surprised you the most? Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other videos where we delve into little-known facts from history.